Guys, what's up? So I had trouble coming up with a title for this episode. Right now it's labeled Urban Renewal and Public Health. I found Carolyn on the internet. Actually, she wrote an article. Read the article and I was really enthused in I wanted to talk to her because of this article. And so I contacted her on LinkedIn and we talked over the phone and she was enthusiastic about coming to talk to me more about it. And so needless to say, I was struggling with the title because there were so many things that we touched upon. We talked about displacement. We talked about alley dwelling. Of course, the main subject is the public health. We talked about disenfranchisement. There were so many things we talked about, and I wanted to all encompass it in the title, and all I got was this urban renewal and public health. Like, it was really, and it's so boring, but this episode is very enriched, and it's a two-way conversation. So I asked her questions, in turn she asked me questions, and we both learned from each other. This week has been interesting, to say the least. One epiphany, at least in the direction as to this learning experiment that I'm doing, is to try to figure out what is the best way to solve this affordable housing, low-income housing crisis that we have right now. How to not disenfranchise people who look like me, the Black and brown people out there. How can architects create housing, new housing, or even if it's new housing, then fine, it's new housing, but use the existing conditions. How can we improve it? And I think that's ultimately what we need to start thinking about. Is we talk about the sustainability, and the best sustainable home is the existing home. So what are the best ways that we can improve the community and not just totally demolish it and start over, or put our imprint into that community without even understanding what that community is about? So it's been a long week, and it's been a growing week for me. So yeah, short and sweet, guys. Here it is. Hi.
Hi.
Carolyn Swope.
Well,
Swope. SWOPE. Right. Swope. How you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Really excited to be here with you and talk about Southwest.
Who are you?
Good question. I'm about to turn 30, so I'm wondering that myself all the time. I am a PhD student in urban planning at Columbia, and actually my background is in public health. I got an MPH before starting the doctoral program, hence the interest in public health with this urban renewal story. And my research interests focus on healthy housing and thinking about that in a pretty broad sense of affordability, the conditions of housing, the stability, whether folks are able to comfortably remain in their homes, as well as the neighborhood context around it, all of which I view as impacting the health of the housing. And I'm particularly interested in healthy housing through the lens of thinking about the historical production of racialized housing inequalities, thinking about how past programs and policies like urban renewal exerted this really inequitable effect on people's housing that has transmitted across generations and informs the disparities we still see today.
Have you been to DC?
Yeah, so I actually lived there for 3 years back in 2013 to 2016, before I moved to New York for grad school.
You went to architecture school, correct?
No, undergrad, I got a degree in anthropology, and then my master's was in public health. And now I guess my urban planning degree technically will be within a school of architecture, planning, and preservation. So
I don't know
sort of architecture adjacent.
I don't know why I thought, yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize for that. Are you from New York? Were you born in New York, or?
No, I'm from outside of Philly. My mom is from the DC area, though. She grew up in Arlington, and my grandfather worked at Georgetown Hospital. So we were always going back and forth from there when I was growing up.
How's life in Philly? You said Philly, right? Or Philadelphia?
Yeah. I'm from outside of Philly. I'm in New York right now. So I'm all up and down the Northeast corridor, I guess.
We talked a little bit about anthropology and how I was just surprised at how broad anthropology is. Like, to me, I just think of people digging up bones or something. Why anthropology?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, it is a really broad field. There absolutely is the element of studying human evolution and studying how human societies have changed across time. But there's also this sociocultural aspect to anthropology, this study of human difference across many forms. And an aspect of that is how societies have created others out of certain groups within their society and use that as justification for inequitable policies. And I think that's something that interested me, is recognizing how artificial some of those categories are, and yet how consequential the creation of those categories has been for how groups are able to thrive within society.
When you were here in DC or DC area for the 3 years you mentioned, were you here for school?
I was working actually. I was working at a healthcare consulting firm, the advisory board. So I guess that healthcare interest was there before I got into public health. I was living at 14th and W, so right at that 14th and U intersection.
So you're in the
And
heart.
that's when I really, sorry?
You were in the heart, sorry.
Yeah. I didn't really know anything about DC before I moved there, so I really lucked out. I responded to like this random ad on Craigslist for a group house, and then it turned out to be at this really amazing intersection. But yeah, that's when I first started getting really aware of and interested in gentrification, since you could just see how rapidly the corridors were transforming. And I don't think you see that rapid of a transformation in other cities. Like, people talk about New York gentrifying, which obviously it is, but I think there's a complete, or not a complete, but a really significant displacement of what was there before, that in a lot of other gentrifying neighborhoods, you still see a lot more Black-owned businesses that have been around for decades and so on. And in DC, it was just really stunning to witness how rapidly it was happening.
So when I found you, I was just a random, like, just Google search. I was actually going back to during the pandemic and everything. I kind of lost track of why I started this podcast in the first place, which is to investigate where I live. So now I'm starting to ramp up my research, and I came across an article that you wrote called the problematic role of public health in Washington, D.C.'s urban renewal. It was on my bucket list to talk about the correlations between public health and how gentrification and displacement, especially with urban renewal. And so this is how I contacted you about it. And you living in DC, and you noticed this within such a short period of time. Were you always aware, as a person, or maybe through your studies through anthropology, were you aware of what was going on? Like, you're like, oh wait, this wasn't here before. Like, what sparked your interest, I guess, and how did that transform into public health for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs. I didn't grow up in the city. And I think going back and forth between that environment of these very green, very manicured suburbs that had been created in this, process of white flight throughout the 50s and 60s, and then going into Philadelphia, where there's been a lot of disinvestment, and now we're starting to see some gentrification in some neighborhoods, but overall, much more disinvestment than the suburbs. And then going to school in St. Louis, where, again, a lot of disinvestment, not seeing the same types of pressures of gentrification. I mean, certainly to some extent, some neighborhoods are, but really seeing abandonment and disinvestment, I guess primed me to recognize gentrification in DC, even though that wasn't really something that had been happening in the environments that I was in before, by seeing how different built environments can reflect the investment or lack of investment that is put into them, and the ways that is something that is very much racialized, very much shaped by race and class.
The public health aspect of it, though, and it's something that I haven't really come across. And I think that's what really drawn me to this particular article, especially with last year and the whole Black Lives Matter, and with the former administration's policies and executive orders really put forth how the disenfranchisement of the Black community and how it affects us personally on a healthy level. For you to see that early on, even before you even knew what was going on, I didn't even notice it. And I don't know if that's because of my environment and how subtle of a change could affect me health-wise. It's one thing when you live by an industrial plant, right? And they're contaminating the drink water. Is another thing where the landlord isn't repairing anything and you realize your surroundings is unhealthy, not because of a chemical reaction, but because of blight, I guess is the best word to put it.
Yeah, I mean, so when we think about our health, I think what most people think of as determining it off the bat is our behaviors. Are people eating healthy? Are they smoking? Are they exercising? Or they think about genetics and they think, there's some sort of genetic component to who gets XYZ illness. But really to a much, I don't know if I could say much greater because it's hard to quantify, but to a really significant extent, our physical environments and our social environments also have this huge influence on our health. And so what ends up sort of getting that out in the form of a health outcome is the sum of all of these very different types of exposures that we come to embody, that come to be written under our skin. And that can be something like, chemicals in our drinking water, but it could also be, if people are experiencing racial discrimination every day and the chronic stress that's associated with that. And that's something that could be really relevant, of course, in gentrifying neighborhoods. If people who are used to being part of a community, now there's people who look at them a certain way and treat them differently. So all of these different types of things can all absolutely impact our health. And it's tricky with blight because something that I think is actually very relevant in the Southwest story is that, yes, absolutely, housing conditions, the physical housing conditions, the physical neighborhood conditions impact our health. If the structure is not very sound, if it's not meeting fire safety standards, things like that. Yes, obviously that can have an adverse impact on health. But at the same time, there are lots of other aspects of housing that can also impact health. So something that was really problematic during urban renewal was that these clearance projects were justified by saying these areas are blighted, they're unhealthy, we have to raise them and build something that's more sanitary. But people's attachment to their homes and to their neighborhoods is also something that affects health. And if you displace people, that's that's not going to have a very positive impact on health.
Right.
You always have to think about it holistically. And the problem with urban renewal was that it looked at it in this very narrow sense of a very particular set of characteristics. And also that the way that it evaluated housing in neighborhoods for those characteristics was pretty selective and pretty strongly informed by racial bias. So that's a pretty long answer to your question.
Why urban renewal? I feel like there's other things you could have tackled, but urban renewal specifically in DC, what drew you to that research?
Yeah, you're right that there are a lot of other processes. Like I think there's so many different kind of links in this chain of serial dispossession. But what initially got me interested was alleys, actually, in sort of a roundabout way. So when I lived in DC, I had noticed some of these alley houses that were still around, in those back service alleys behind people's houses. And I was just curious what their history was. And I knew that there had been more alley houses, but I didn't know why they were no longer there. And so for a project in grad school, I started digging into it a little more, and kind of fortuitously, I guess, for my interest in public health, not fortuitously for the people who lived in the alleys, I found out that the main justification that had been used for raising all of these houses was public health. That all of these reformers in the early 1900s were saying these are unsanitary conditions, actually like pretty hysterical language. They would say these are plague spots, these are pestilential holes, these are breeding grounds of disease, like really, really strong rhetoric about these epidemics in their backyard, which actually were quite overstated. And, again, the conditions were bad. They were not great, lack of running water, lack of indoor toilets, things like that. But alleys also had a lot of assets. They had, really close-knit, supportive communities. They helped people who were moving to the city who didn't have a lot of access to resources for survival and environments that marginalized them. But anyway, so what happened with alleys was that they created this alley dwelling authority to eliminate all of these alleys and move people somewhere else. That was never as strong of a focus. And they ended up choosing Southwest as their first big target for a major scale project because there was a high concentration of alleys there in particular. And at the same time, as they were kind of gearing up for this project, trying to figure out where they would get funding from, what the plan should look like, the federal government passed urban renewal legislation, which made it a lot easier to get funding because the federal government would help out with these projects. So they ended up sort of folding the Southwest project into urban renewal. And so that roundabout way is how I got to.
I didn't know that. So it was actually a catalyst for them to move forward and use this intimate domain to wipe away all these alley homes and displaced all the people there who happened to be African American. One of the things that I got out of your article was the Fully Love's root shock model. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So Mindy Fullilove has done really amazing work on connecting urban renewal to long-term public health impacts for African Americans. So she created a model thinking about 3 different main pathways through which urban renewal might affect people's health. So first, it could directly impact people's health through the stress and the psychological trauma that is involved with your entire community being uprooted, with the scattering of, this entire life that people had in a place. And I think people planning urban renewal projects often thought, oh, people can just move somewhere else. But, it's not like people just up and leave and there's no impact from that. You're being uprooted from a community. The second piece is that displaced residents often moved to communities that had high levels of concentrated poverty, high levels of segregation. And so at the time and still today, because segregation makes it easier to deny resources to those neighborhoods and concentrate them in wealthier, higher SES neighborhoods, that can have effects on health outcomes. If there's fewer good grocery stores, if there's a concentration of industrial pollution, et cetera. And then third, urban renewal also required people to use a lot of their own resources. If you're moving, that's never an easy process. There's always a lot of, stuff that you need. And also it affects their ability to access other resources. So especially for low income folks, oftentimes it's really important to have sort of these informal networks where you know what you can access at a lower price or for free. Maybe the person who lives a few doors down can help to babysit your kids while you're working, something like that. And when people are scattered, you lose those networks, you lose those ties, and perhaps you have to spend more on finding other ways to access resources, and they may be more expensive. So those were the 3 main pathways.
When I read that in your art, well, I read parts of it in your article and then I looked her up, and it really made a lot of sense in how I was feeling and what was going on in my mind when I was living and experiencing growing up in Tyler House. So Southwest One, of course, was the first experiment in this urban renewal in DC. And then you have Northwest One, which kind of took the lessons from Southwest One and kind of, improved it on a little bit. I hear all the bad things about urban renewal and including how it affected me and affected people in my past, like the past residents prior to the whole construction of that area. For example, like I discovered that a lot of Christian organizations came together to build each of these housing projects within Northwest One. And the one Tyler House, it was a Black church that created that project and a female architect that designed it, the same architect that did Southwest One. In that sense, I feel like that story is beautiful. And the intent of building that community was really pure. I mean, it had a grocery store, it had a school, it had a clinic, it had everything that that community needed. It had Christian support, whether it be Baptist or Catholic. Like it had all the ingredients to have a successful community. Unfortunately, did not experience, because I wasn't born at that time, was the fruitfulness of that area. And what happened with Southwest One in the 40s, 50s, I think, happened to me in the 90s. So and it's the same feeling, same correlation that, you have a government entity, whether you want to believe that they wanted to help these people or just wanted the land, same thing with me, to help these people or to start over again, get these people out, get your crimes down, and sort of reinvent, renew Tower House, or even to this day, that area. I'm talking too much.
No, this is really interesting, and I've been really curious what parallels you see between Southwest and Northwest One. Could you just speak a little more to what you're referring to in terms of what happened in the 90s at Tyler House? I'm not.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm sorry. So crack happened, drugs. So briefly in Tyler House, it went through a couple of management companies. So the original developers was, again, a church, a Black church, and they never managed a 300 unit apartment before. And this is, according to my research, I haven't reached out to them at all. I need to, if they're willing to talk to me, how they never managed it before. And then they end up filing for bankruptcy. And then HUD took over the property. And parallel to that, the Reagan administration had come up with some tax laws or something, or tax incentives, I guess. So it made Tyler House real estate portfolio for stocks. I'm not really versed on that part of the language, but the people who were invested in Tyler House, some way, somehow, they would end up making money for it. And the money that was supposed to go to the people didn't. I'm paraphrasing greatly with what I just explained. But because of that and poor management, the repairs just never happened. The elevators were always broken. Violence ensued in and around that neighborhood. And I grew up in that. I remember going to sleep at night and trying to bury myself under the covers because I was afraid that bullets would fly through my window. You would hear gunshots and you're like, firecrackers or gunshots. And I did this in a presentation one time. I actually remember where our apartment looked out. It was looked out the parking lot. And this is where they kept the trash cans, the huge garbage cans that they come, the metal ones, and dumpsters. Dumpsters. And a guy got shot there, and Marion Barry came, and it was all these news cameras. I'm looking outside, and it was that wasn't an everyday occurrence, but it was you don't want your neighborhood to make the news that way, put it that way. This is what drew me to your public health thing, because it was built during a time where asbestos was not known to be a carcinogen. They laced in construction material. So the apartment complex had asbestos drywall and flooring. So they knew this, and they were doing renovations to get that out. And they were trying to keep it on the down low, but some way, somehow the information got out. They tried to save money when they were doing the renovations. They did in phasing. So the top floors, it's a 12-story building, but it's divided into sections. So some stopped at the level 8 floor, some stopped at the 12th floor. It varied. The one that we lived under, the tower, I think it stopped at the 8th floor. So anyway, so they cleared out all those floors, or maybe it's 8 floors, period. Don't quote me on this, on the number of floors, I can't remember. They displaced people on the first couple of floors, like the 8th, 7th, and 6th floor, let's just say. So Those families got moved out and were living in hotels until they find another temporary solution for them. Or maybe they did. I don't know at the time. So the renovations were taking place during the winter, and they decided to not heat those floors to save money. It's winter and DC winters. The pipes froze and the water burst, wetting all of the gyp walls. Now the spores are out and the water trickled down to the apartments below. So we lived on the third floor. There was a panic because you had to leave your apartment. They found out that your walls were wet. You had to evacuate immediately. Like, you grabbed all your stuff and you just left. That traumatized me as a kid. So I created a go bag, because I was like, what if I forget this? What if I can forget that? And the families lost everything. Like, they just, whatever they can grab, they grabbed, and that was it. It's like worse than a fire, I think, because at least your things were destroyed. This is like, your things are fine. It's just the dust that's surrounding your stuff is not. They lived in hotels. There was a news article. They lived in the hotel that they were living in. They were just, quote unquote, destroying the place. Like, their kids would run down the hallway, and that's not the case, because you just lost everything because some management guy made a decision that he wanted to save money on heating costs. So that public health part drew me to your stuff and the parallels, because again, this is in the 90s, mid to late 90s, and the stuff that you were reporting happened like 40 years prior, and it's the same feeling.
Yeah, wow, thank you for sharing that. I had never heard that story before, and it's crazy how much of a parallel it really is between Southwest and what happened there. And I think we see similar things still with Hope 6, which recently ended, but was, this really major program to overhaul public housing by tearing down so much of it because of the conditions. And now RAD, which is essentially privatizing a lot of public housing because the public housing authorities are saying, we don't have the funds to repair these conditions, so we'll turn it over to private entities who will repair it instead. And we just see the same things happening over and over again, that there's so much priority placed on housing conditions, which are really important. But then the question is, how did the conditions get to that point, right? What decisions were made by the people who had the power to keep the conditions healthy in the first place? And why was there less emphasis placed on stability, on keeping people in their homes, on finding a way either to prevent those conditions from happening or addressing them in a way that does keep people in their home?
There was a quote that I found. I'm just throwing it out there. It doesn't really mean anything. Well, it means something. A comment about urban renewal. He said, it's not hard to tear down a community when you don't even see it as one. And that really, I didn't even know he made a comment about urban renewal. And then I found this, and I was like, that is so true. How it just resonates to this day.
When you look at these indicators that they use to evaluate neighborhoods for renewal, we know that community matters so much for health, but they didn't look at anything related to community to make these assessments. Everything was these very technical and ostensibly objective indicators, like, I don't know, the amount of lighting that a hallway could get, that type of thing, or whether a lot has single family homes on it or apartments, and they didn't want to see apartments. And that, really doesn't reflect the importance of community for people's health. And it just, wasn't something that was a major priority for them.
So I'm going to tap into your urban planning education. Did they talk about this at all? Did they talk about displacement? Did they talk about, I'm curious.
I would say in public health, the field has overall had a pretty technical orientation for a long time. Like, it kind of blows my mind how little urban renewal is discussed in public health, given that the American Public Health Association literally created this appraisal method that was used to determine which neighborhoods should be targeted for renewal. They created these really long and detailed checklists where you could score all of these different aspects of the physical environment of housing in neighborhoods for whether they were healthful or not. And then they would make these recommendations based on the penalty score. So for Southwest, you can see every block with the APHA's assessment, and a lot of them are over this cutoff where they say, this is very bad housing that should have definite priority for demolition and redevelopment. So the APHA was, very complicit in leading urban renewal. And that's, frankly, not something that I ever hear people in public health talk about. I think we're starting to get to a point in public health where people are more aware of the health effects of urban renewal. I think Mindy Fulop's work has been really eye-opening for a lot of people, and it's really pushed people to be more aware of the role of these historical processes. I think people are starting to recognize the role of other processes too, like redlining in shaping long-term health outcomes. But I think there's a lot of room to grow in public health. We're taking these concepts and processes and the field's role in them really seriously. In planning, I'm just starting to enter the planning field, actually. Like, this is my first year in getting a planning education. But I think urban renewal is something that is discussed a lot more often in planning than in public health. Probably, for the fairly obvious reason that urban renewal is a planning project. But yeah, I think public health really has a long way to go with that.
Are you enjoying urban planning classes?
I am really enjoying it. Yeah, it's exciting to get a different set of tools in my toolbox for looking at these same issues. Like with urban renewal, for example, I think getting the public health lens for thinking about why its impact might be so consequential was really illuminating. But with planning, I get a different lens of, what was going on in the planning profession at the time. What were the guiding ideologies? How did planners think about their responsibilities and what their desired outcomes would be? And that's also really helpful for understanding these processes. And the same with gentrification, which is what I want to study for my dissertation. I think public health is starting to grapple with what the health effects of gentrification might be. Then in planning, you can get a lot more background on theories as to how gentrification happens. What are these cycles of investment and disinvestment? So it's been really helpful to be able to have both perspectives on the same issues.
What's your opinion on this? I'm kind of curious. You're like the outsider looking in on this whole, to me anyway. Well, the question I'm about to ask you is, what do you think the role of the architect played in all this? In urban planning? And
so I think architects at the time definitely saw themselves as playing a role in planning and seemed to view the buildings that they created within the context of the neighborhoods and within the context of certain ideologies about what neighborhoods should look like and how buildings can achieve certain social goals. So if you think about, for example, Le Corbusier, whose work informed very much the architectural style of urban renewal and this whole modernist look and feel of buildings, he certainly had these ideas that, we should have these really car-centric neighborhoods, that everything should be vertical, and that was going to be the best way for people to most efficiently live their lives. And there's this whole emphasis on efficiency and on the planner and the architect knowing what the best goals should be and the best ways to achieve those goals. And you don't really see any way that the public can provide much input into that. It's very, top down, planner knows best. So I think we certainly see that with the plans that architects proposed for Southwest, right? That I'm not sure how to say her first name, Chloe Smith and her partner made for the plan that ultimately in adaptive form was used for Southwest, that they wanted this really grand sweeping overhaul of the neighborhood. And somebody else had actually proposed a plan that focused more on rehabilitation of housing that would allow more residents to stay there. and didn't have a lot of emphasis on new luxury housing. And they said about that plan that it was timid and unimaginative and defeatist. And they very much fell into this camp that the architect should be involved with, these sweeping overhauls of areas that achieved some kind of broader, again, social goal. And I think, I'm sure you have more perspective on that. I think absolutely, all professions, including architecture, should have some kind of broader goal for the work that they do. But I think there's the question of how you arrive at that goal, how you determine it, who else you listen to in developing that goal. And for them, they did not really listen to anyone other than
themselves
who were like them, white wealthy people. And the goals that they had were really problematic. So yeah, I guess the short answer to your question would be that I think architecture was very much complicit in urban renewal, that there was this idea that they knew what the goals should be and they knew how to get there, and everything that went counter to that was, it should just be ignored or wiped away.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
There was a podcast interview that I did called Decolonize Architecture, sorry. And they're from Great Britain. And one of the interviewees said was that architects design for the time. During that time, that was the way. The white way was the way. And the ideology of the people who were currently living in that community didn't matter. They have a responsibility. Architects during that time had a responsibility to make society better. That ego-ness in the same era of like the Frank Lloyd Wrights, all those guys had that same ideology. Does architecture have culture? And I paused for a second because the culture isn't mine. And even the modernism, right? The clean look, the straight lines, the simpleness of furniture. What culture is that? What does that translate into the world globally? Like, is that the ideal culture to have? And it kind of just spiraled down in my mind of what does Washington, D.C. mean? Even the 3 years you were here, you noticed the rapid change, the changing of the neighborhood I grew up in. I don't recognize it anymore. I used to live in Boston, and when I go back, it's still the same. There's like one or two high-rise buildings that came up. I'm like, oh, that's new. Oh, that's new. When I go to DC, it's like, am I even in DC? Like you look at the street sign to confirm. And it's traumatic to me to this day. I don't even live there. I've been removed from that area for decades. What does all this mean? And whose culture are you trying to create here? Because that's essentially what it is. I did this presentation where I show Tower House on one side and this new apartment complex on the other. And if you look at the census of 2000, I think it was 2000, Tower House median income was 38,000. Across the street was like 120. These people are literally living across the street from each other. What does that mean? What does that mean for the neighborhood? Who has a louder voice? Is it the $38,000 median household income, or is the $120,000 median household income? I mean, I'm pretty sure they're going to try to get that land from Tower House because it's at a prime location. Oh my gosh, it's the entrance into Washington, D.C. coming from Maryland, and like a good jog to the Capitol. I shouldn't say good. It's probably 3 miles, I guess. But it's a nice jog to the Capitol. And where I feel like this is my voice, architects are responsible for this. We are complacent in this. And this is my own. And I don't know if I was to ask an architect the same thing, I think it'll be a deeper debate about it because, again, we only design for the time. It's not our fault, right? I think if Chloetha was alive today and I was to talk to her, what would her attitude be towards me? I wouldn't be able to have that architectural conversation with her. The way that, and I think that she designed, I have no problems with the way she designed Tower House, actually. It was, she made it into family, because that's the thing that they did with these projects, is that they created for large families. Like that was the thing throughout this whole urban renewal projects thing, is that this is a 5-family household. This is a 7-family household. There's like 6 bedrooms here. And there were in Tower House, there were ones they were luxury apartments that we would call today. It was 2 stories. But what happens when you have all these children, all these kids, and they're living in a high-rise apartment? The system of the father, you can't have a whole family either. But that's politics. That's policy. That's not architecture. But I'm kind of curious how this conversation would go if she was alive and I was like, I lived in one of your properties, the properties that other architects don't talk about because it's a blight on us, the failed urban renewal, the failed Pruitt-Igos, Yeah.
I'm curious, what would you say that architects should do, right? If we're thinking about architecture in the context of gentrification and the context of contributing to these new luxury high income developments that further gentrification, do you think that there's a way that architects can design buildings to mitigate harmful impacts? Do you think it's about deciding which types of projects architects agree to be involved with? Like what would you want to see the profession do? If it's okay for me to ask you a question.
No. This is not a one-way conversation. Not at all. I'm learning from you as much as you're learning from me. I think in terms of sustainability, the best sustainable way you can build is not build. Use the context that you already have. So I would not tear down Tower House. I would repair it. The first thing that should be on the list of any architectural, I've been thinking about this. The first thing that we need to do is have phasing. Don't displace, phase. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Is that you do sections at a time. You don't massively move people. You just create housing for the people on their property and do one half, renovate that, move those people onto the other side, fix the other half, and then everybody's happy. That way you're not losing your community, you're not losing school systems, you're not losing any of that. You're moving across the hall. You're moving a block up, whatever. And something like DC, they can do that. If you're going to use intimate, there's this thing that has been burning in my head. So New York Avenue, there's this intersection. So you're coming off from BW Parkway, there's Florida Avenue, is that K Street? No, I forgot what street that is. There's like intersection that's like super confusing now.
I remember that intersection.
There's a Wendy's.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right in the middle.
I've been stuck in traffic there many times.
And so this Wendy's been there since I've been there. And it's been there since my mom came to the US. So this Wendy's is like 50 years old. This is like the OG of Wendy's, right? And the district wants to use eminent domain to tear down that Wendy's to make the traffic flow better. So it's not a rotary around the Wendy's and people don't know where, whatever. I'm furious because they're going to offer that owner $1.3 million for that. And I'm mad because DC has $1.3 million. I'm like, you could use that money to house the homeless people that's like not too far from you, because there's like a whole homeless camp population over there. There's that. Then there's the mere fact that is the Office of Planning. So it's this transportation thing. And DC is like notorious for eliminating streets. Like they will put a bike lane in like 2 seconds. They just take away the cars. They hate cars. So for you to tell me that you can block off the street, you can create a new street, you can do so many things to save this historical landmark. And then I saw the plans, and they want to put a park where there's a ATF building, like where you get off. They want to put a park over there. And I'm like, isn't there a McDonald's over there? There used to be like a club. I don't know if you remember that club. There's a club there, Ibiza, whatever. Why are you putting a park there? And then I'm thinking that's that scenario I was telling you about where Tyler House is on cross street from like 120 income. There's that underpass that happens on North Capitol Street. Why don't you just build a park there? You could just throw some beams and build a park bridging these two communities. Just build a little park there. It's a nicer look for when you look at the Capitol, like whatever, instead of just openness. Just put a park over there. And it's precedent because they're doing that over by 395. They have buildings over there now. They used to be all open because you have the interstate going right under there. That's just an example of how my neighborhood is leaving me. Because even the Wendy's, they want to take it down. And I'm like, what are the motives? What is the serious motives? Because that area, all that area over there is this high rise. And, you know, as a person in this industry, that's work for us. I am promoting, don't build anything new. I'm tired of new. Don't build anything new. You have enough housing there. You're the amount of housing that you're allowing low income residents to stay there, the percentage is too low. I mean, if you have a 300 unit apartment and you use 10%, 5%, let's say it's 10%, it's easier. 30 out of 300? And you displaced 120? Like, how does that work? How does that math work? It doesn't. I'm just trying to use some common sense in this. There's just always a deeper story in everything, but the excuse of it's easier to put it on the developer, and the developer's like, I need to make money. And they're like, okay, let's lax all these things that we have for the residents of DC and supersede it for you because you're helping us out. You're helping our numbers look better. So that's my long answer.
Yeah, I think there is this fundamental problem that any attempts to address housing affordability through the private market are going to run into, which is that if we try to deliver affordability through developers, you know, they're always going to hit a point where they're like, I'm not going to make enough money if I do it that way. If I include more affordable units, if they're at a lower, you know, a deeper level of affordability. And then city governments say, oh, well, if we try to make this a requirement, private developers won't do it. So we can't do that. So that, I mean, at least in New York, that's a really major limit on how much we're able to deliver with the affordable housing programs here. And, you know, they're honestly, like, when you look at the grand scheme of how many people are struggling with affordability in DC and New York, these programs are very timid. They're not deeply enough affordable for many people. They're not at a scale of affordability that we need. I mean, to your point, you know, it's a small percentage of these very expensive, very high rent buildings. And so I think that brings up the question of alternative models for delivering affordable housing, like community land trusts, limited equity co-op, mechanisms that move housing outside of this speculative market and the pressures to drive up costs and rent higher and higher, which I think actually do have a pretty long history in DC, that there have been a number of really successful co-op in maintaining low-income housing. So that's something that I think should be more on our radar moving forward, is how can we promote different types of models of social housing, not necessarily just public housing, but also other types like community land trusts and co-op.
I remember us talking about the whole like alley housing, alley dwelling. I forgot what. Remind me again, that's your research, correct? Like currently, that's what you're doing, or?
Yeah, that's one of the projects I'm working on. So I'm looking at assessing how accurate the claims of the reformers were that alleys really were breeding grounds of disease. Because I was skeptical that they really were as quote unquote pestilential as reformers really claimed they were. Because like we talked about with urban renewal, there was really a lot of bias in how people perceived the housing as being helpful or unhelpful, depending on who lived there, and a lot of blindness to the root causes of people living in poorer quality housing. So what I did was I found a data set from the Board of Health from the early 1900s. And so I'm mapping how many people actually died of infectious disease in each alley. And what I'm finding is that, it really was not this terrifying large scale epidemic that they perceived it as, but rather that their perceptions that because alleys were spaces of Black people, they must inherently be diseased, was really influencing how they then talked about alleys and how they understood alleys, especially because the alleys were, right in their own backyards. I think there was a level to which people perceived that spatial proximity and thought that there was a risk that the infectious disease might spread to them because the alleys were so close to them. And it was a very different pattern of segregation than we have today, where segregation is more on the neighborhood level. So yeah, I think all of these different pieces came together, the segregation patterns, the fear of disease, the underlying racialized perceptions of space, to push reformers to clear out these spaces when there really wasn't a lot of justification for it.
Is this unique in DC, or is it in terms of alleys? Was that a unique thing in DC?
Alleys are pretty common in southern cities. I think that there was a small presence of these types of inhabited alleys in northern cities as well, but they were more common in southern cities. That's something that I want to look more into. For example, I know in Charleston they were pretty common, but I think DC is a particularly clear case, and a case where there was a really high proportion of people living in alleys. I mean, it wasn't that high overall. It was, maybe 4% or so of the city's population, but relatively speaking. And I think in London, actually, which was sort of the epicenter of early thinking about housing and planning and disease, I think there was a number of alleys there as well. I think before transportation advances allowed people to move farther out from the city, if there was a significant enough population pressure, then people had to start looking at these creative places that they could fit people in the city, because people would have to, be in walking distance of their jobs.
You have any other questions or anything like that before we wrap up?
One thing that you said that really resonated with me that I wanted to just circle back to was that you felt like the neighborhood was leaving you when you go back to it. And I think when people think about displacement, they often think of it in the sense of physical displacement of people leaving the neighborhood. But from everything that we're seeing with gentrification, I think we should also think about displacement in terms of the neighborhood that people knew leaving, right? That you can still be in the same place, but if everything is changing around you, is that a form of displacement too? So curious what you think about that.
I don't know. Because like I said, like I've been removed from that area, right? Cicely Tyson passed away. So she was in her 90s. And I sit back, I'm thinking like, okay, all the things she has witnessed. Did you see Planes for the first time? I'm bad in history. You've seen a lot through that time. The world has changed. The area that you grew up in has changed. So some place like New York City, she goes compared to the 50s to now. New York City is completely different, especially Manhattan, from what it was in the 80s to what it is now. I use that frame of mind when I go into DC. I'm old. I'm I'm not 94, but there are things that I remember that my 10-year-old nephew won't remember. Like he was after 9/11, being able to go to the airport, your whole family could go and walk you to the plane, walk you to your seat, versus you just drop them off and just run off, like how it is now. So I try to gain that perspective that time is moving, things change. Your question, it makes sense, and it explains a lot about me and how I feel about this profession and how I'm still trying to be in this profession. I left that aspect of working of multifamily housing because I didn't like how we as architects did things. And to change that system is extremely difficult. And it won't be done in my lifetime. Maybe 100 years from now. Maybe. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it does. I guess one thing I want to probe a little further though is thinking about how everything changes. And I do think there's an extent to which, there's natural change that happens in neighborhoods, but at the same time, neighborhoods that experience gentrification so rapidly, it feels like there are conditions that allow that to happen, right? That there was so much prior disinvestment in neighborhoods that it's so easy for speculative companies to buy up the land at low prices and so on. So I don't know, I'm curious if you would agree with that or how that you think that might complicate.
Oh no, I totally agree. It's easier to, like, they have this thing called opportunity zones now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the definition of opportunity zones, it's my neighborhood. But they're also fighting the affluent neighborhoods as well. So areas in Georgetown, for example, they haven't seen, if you go to Georgetown right now, it looks exactly what you remember Georgetown to be. In the Benetton corner and that is like Wisconsin and M, that intersection.
Mm-hmm.
Always looks at that intersection. That bank is on that corner. Like, for you as a developer to come in and try to, like, they try to open an Apple store, and Apple has this look, and the amount of time for Apple to deal with the regulations and the people who don't want that change. My neighborhood never had a architectural design guidelines, right? And it didn't. And if it did, it kind of did. There's like this deed covenant thing that you can't displace these low income people for like 50 years or some random number. But they worked around that. It's been 50 years or 70 years or however years that they put it up. And they just waited. And now it's time. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I agree on that. If you go back home to when you were at 12 years old, did that change for you or?
No, not a lot has changed there. I mean, I grew up in very low density suburbs. Like it's a lot of, single family homes on acre lots, like not a lot of commercial around. Like there's like little mini downtown areas with commercial stuff, but I mean, overall there's, it's a white suburb. Like there's not a whole lot of new development that they're building or anything like that. I mean, there's, a few areas that used to be farmland that people are building on, but not a lot. So, I mean, I think that also gets to my question about, certain neighborhoods, because of past disinvestment, presenting the conditions where developers are going to profit and going to present conditions for gentrification. And if you look at the type of suburb where I grew up, because there was already so much investment there, because there's already so many people who have the political power to design it exactly the way they want it to be and keep it that way, it's unlikely that you see that kind of major change, right? Some places have that kind of built-in protection from that. And I haven't actually looked too much at, the original zoning codes or anything for the suburbs where I grew up, but I'm sure that they had exclusionary zoning in place where you can only build single family homes, or there's a minimum lot size and so on. And, those things are very intentionally designed to create a certain kind of neighborhood and to keep it that way. So yes, there's there's much less change happening there than there is in previously disinvested urban areas.
I mean, it's fascinating that DC is Chocolate City, and they've had a black mayor for a very long time and a majority Black council, but that doesn't seem to mean much in terms of trying to retain historical value. Like, they love Ben's Chili Bowl, but there's other aspects of the city that needs to be retained. I always should I fight for this? And then should I argue? Should I do something, right? Like a call to action. But then I stop myself because I don't live in that neighborhood now. I really don't. I don't know what the people want now. Do they want that Wendy's gone? Do they want that McDonald's gone? I don't know. I like to assume that they wouldn't, but
mm-hmm. And where do you live now? I don't think we talked.
Oh, I live in Columbia, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah, I mean, I imagine that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was definitely a plant community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is that near Greenbelt?
No, I'm between Baltimore and DC. So there was this guy this is a very plant community, walkable, safest place to live, that type of thing.
Yeah, I was just wondering because we were just learning about Greenbelt in one of my classes, and it's a pretty fascinating, weird example of architecture around the same time.
It's yeah.
I remember them being close.
Because Greenbelt is in PG County. I live in Howard County. And PG County in itself is interesting, and how there's little spots of white neighborhoods in PG County. And it's a huge county. You have farmland when you go down further away. But in that Greenbelt has a spot of white community. There's just Cheverly. That's another spot. There's a white a lot. I know 2-3 architects that live in Cheverly. And so it's interesting how these neighborhoods still is to this day are still like that, but are surrounding by Black people, affluent Black people. So I don't know much about Greenbelt though. What? I'm curious, because it's another plant community, is that?
Yeah, it was this garden city experiment where the architect, from what I recall, wanted to create this, completely planned and sort of novel type of community where it was very focused on blending the country and the city, and they would try to have the places where people worked and their homes and all of the amenities located all together in this one very self-sufficient and enclosed neighborhood. And that garden city ideal, I think, influenced a lot of architecture during that period, but was usually not implemented quite as thoroughly, I guess. So it was a little experiment.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, this has been really fun to get to talk about my research. I mean, not fun in the sense of the story. The story itself is very sad, but fun to chat with you about it. And really interesting to learn more about Northwest. And I definitely want to learn more about what happened there. So thanks for sharing your story about that.
And thank you for researching and putting that article out there and all the other articles you put out there. And thank you for writing and researching and just caring about this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think with academia, we have so much pressure to create journal articles as the form by which our career can advance. But then I worry, am I putting this journal article out there and only people who can get past that paywall, who are themselves immersed in academia, seeing them? So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk about that research to a broader audience outside of that, very narrow circle. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
No problem. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Hey, listeners. I have an exciting announcement. I decided to launch a membership program for the show, where you have a chance to support me and the show directly. I love creating the show, and it means the world to me that you all tune in to keep hearing me week after week. But it takes an immense amount of time and energy to produce. I want to keep the show going, and I want to invest in its growth. And I also want you to become a partner with me in this journey. That's why I'm excited to give you a chance to officially become a supporter of the show at glow.fm/archispolly, ARCHISPOLLY, or by clicking the link in the show notes. It's quick and easy. It takes less than 30 seconds and just takes clicking a link in the show notes and using Apple or Google Pay. You don't have to create any new logins, and you can contribute as much or as little as you like. If this show is part of your day or week, and you like what I'm doing, then visit glow.fm/archispolly, all one word, and support me and the show in any way you can today.